Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to the talk this morning. To get started, give you a little background so you have some idea of where I'm coming from. What I'll be talking about has been drawn from actually about 4 decades of OBM research. We've conducted some of that research. Many others have conducted it as well. We'll also be drawing some from our own supervisory experience. I'll try to let you know when I'm speaking from the hard data versus the soft data in terms of experience versus research. And when I say our, I've been fortunate to have worked with some very, very competent and personal people over the years. Fortunate to work with under your other keynote speaker, John Bailey, where I learned most of my research skills. When I say our here, I'm talking primarily about the work that Marcia Parsons and Carolyn Green and I have done in the staff area over the years. We've taken these approaches within our agencies, and for the last decade or so, we've been training supervisors across the state of South Carolina and their community service programs for people, primarily adults with intellectual disabilities. Let me ask y'all, how many of y'all are in a supervisory position where you're at least in part responsible for the work performance of others? Okay. How many of y'all are in a clinical type position where you don't have direct supervisory authority over people, but you're dependent on them to carry out your programs in one way or another? How many are in that situation? A few. Okay. Those of you who raised your hand, how many of you received as much training in supervising typical adults, if you will, versus the amount of training you received in your other field? I'm assuming everybody has another field, such as psychology or social work, special ed. How many of you received as much training in how to be a supervisor as you did in how to do whatever your main field is? 2. That's pretty typical. Most of us aren't trained, who end up in supervisory positions, weren't formally trained to do that. Now that's changing in large part in behavior analysis and in some programs who do focus on evidence-based approaches to supervision. But for the most part, people in supervisory positions have not been formally trained to do what they do. And the training they have received, if any, typically is not focusing on evidence-based procedures. Those of you who did raise your hands, any of you work as a supervisor in residential services? A few. Well, those of you who do, my hat goes off to you. Because if any of you, those of you who have worked in residential services, it's tough duty. It never, ever goes away. It's 24/7. And you know what I'm talking about. This is not to say that those of you who are supervisors in other settings think it's not difficult. It certainly can be. But I do not work in residential services anymore. I work more in day services, but I did for 22 years. So again, my hat goes off to you. So qualifications on what I'll be going over. I'm going to focus on supervisory skills for supervisors of direct support staff, not looking at supervising professional or executive personnel. We're talking about people who supervise direct support staff in residential services, day programs, schools to a lesser degree. And the reason for that is that really has been the focus, that is supervisors of direct support staff, of most of the behavior analytic research over the years. That's also been where most of our experience has existed. A few premises. One, and I don't know, I assume most of y'all are from Florida. I can't speak very well about the service systems in Florida, but for better or worse, I've worked or consulted with agencies in most of the states of the country, and the vast majority of human service agencies are not behavioral. And when I say not behavioral, meaning they are not managed in a behavioral manner with clear specification of performance duties, control over appropriate contingencies, and so forth. There are exceptions, of course. There are some very nice exceptions, but the vast majority of human service agencies are not operated that way. And that's part of why we do what we do in order to help agencies become more behavioral, more productive in terms of providing the types of supports and services for consumers with disabilities that they're intended to provide. In the human services, I think everybody's aware of the importance of the performance of direct support staff. By direct support staff, I'm talking about people who work with the clients, work with the folks with disabilities. Direct support staff in the residential settings, teacher assistants, folks in adult day services. That's well acknowledged. They spend more time with agency clients than anybody else in the agency and have the biggest impact on daily quality of life of individuals with disabilities. What's not quite as well acknowledged, although it's becoming more so, is the importance of the supervision of the performance of direct support staff. It's important from two primary perspectives relating to the characteristics of support staff. First, as many of y'all know, people who enter the direct support workforce usually have no formal training in what it takes to do their job. Or if they have experience in other settings, often it's not very relevant to the setting in which they obtain new employment. And speaking of characteristics of folks, y'all are looking way too serious. And I can't speak for those of you in the back because I can't see that far, but I'm assuming it's a serious look. It may be general apathy, I don't know. But I don't know if it's the topic or if it's the time of day or it's moi. So hangover, we won't go there. So I have something else to say about the characteristics of people. This is a joke. Okay? So there's a group of brain surgeons at a conference. Okay? They've had a few drinks, they're sitting around the table, and they're talking about who they most like to do brain surgery on. And one of the brain surgeons says, well, I like to do brain surgery on accountants, because when you open up their skull and look at their brain, all the parts are numbered. It makes it easy. The other guy says, no. I like to do electricians, because when you look at their brain, all parts are color-coded. Right? And other brain surgeon says, no, construction workers. Guys look at him, other surgeons, why? He says, well, they understand when the job takes longer than it's supposed to. And they also understand when you leave a few parts at the work site. And finally, the last brain surgeon says, no, it's politicians. And so why politicians? Well, first, when you open up the skull, you don't have very much brain matter to work with, so it's not very difficult. And if you screw up, you've got an alternative. Because this part and the backside part, they're the same. Anyway, all right. Back on task. You can go back to your general apathy. Characteristics of support staff. There's a need for training. And most of the functional training of direct support staff comes from their immediate supervisor. You know, those of you who've gone through an orientation program in human service agencies do very relevant and important stuff, but often it does not relate or carry over to what they need to do day to day. That usually falls on the responsibility of the supervisor. There's also a need for motivation of direct support staff to promote diligent and proficient work performance. And let me give you a little scenario to illustrate the importance of needing to motivate direct support staff. When I'm home, I'm going to my office, I'll stop at this little convenience store on the way to get a cup of coffee frequently. And the people who work behind the counter turn over from time to time. And there's this one woman who'd been there for a few months, and I'd seen her several days a week, for a number of weeks as I'd go in and get my coffee. And finally, she asked me, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I work with agencies who serve people who have severe intellectual disabilities." And I just got a blank stare in response to that. I said, "Well, I work with agencies who serve people who have autism." I said, "Oh, well, my niece is autistic." And then she looks at me and she says, "You must be a good and patient person." And I'm thinking, well, at best, the jury's still out on whether I'm a good person. I know I'm not a patient person. But have you ever had that response? If you're in the human services, you'll get it at some point, okay? And what that means is often people who are not in our field think that folks go into the human services and in a direct support capacity because of an inherent concern for the welfare of people with disabilities. And certainly some do, no question about it. And some because they have a family member with a disability. Some because they have a family member who has worked in the human services. But frankly, that's not why most people go into the job of direct support staff. They go into a job just like you and me have in many cases because it's the best available job they can find at the time. Okay? And what that means is we should not assume, you know this, that an inherent desire to help people with disabilities is going to motivate staff to work diligent and proficiently day in and day out. Okay? Now, another basic premise, importance of acceptable supervision, and that is promoting workplace enjoyment. When we work with supervisors, our goals are to equip them with the tools that help their staff work diligently, work proficiently, and enjoy their work. Most folks agree with trying to get diligent and proficient work. We get some controversy when we focus on workplace enjoyment. But we stress that. That's kind of like the trifecta of supervision. Folks are working hard, working proficiently, and they're enjoying what they're doing. That's what we want to get for. But not everybody agrees with the enjoyment part. So let me focus on that just a little bit. And other people have said this much more eloquently than I can, but when we don't supervise in a way that's acceptable to folks, we take an alternative approach or a contradictory approach. That is, we supervise primarily in a punitive or negative manner. There are a lot of effects of that. One, it diminishes work motivation. In essence, what happens is in those agencies, there's little supervisory attention directed to the performance of direct support staff until there's a problem. And then there's heightened attention. Okay? Good work goes unrecognized, problematic work gets punished, in essence. So staff learn, okay, do the least amount possible to avoid the wrath of the supervisor, because the more you do, the more likely you're going to get criticized by part of what you do. So it diminishes work motivation. And you know how punishment works. If one is working primarily to avoid the wrath of the supervisor, negative reinforcement paradigm, if the punishing agent isn't around, there's little motivation to work. And you've seen situations, those of you who work in the field, where there's problems with staff performance. They do okay as long as supervisor's there. But when the supervisor's not around, work diligence decreases significantly. That's one of the problems with managing with a punitive style. Promote staff withdrawal. Actually, we don't have real good hard data on this. But it seems logical, right? That if you really don't like your job, you're probably going to call in sick more often than if you really like your job when you're not sick. You're probably going to be more eager to seek other employment if you really don't like your job. So it probably affects withdrawal. Definitely interferes with productive work. When there's a lot of negativity in the workplace, if staff are really discontented with what's going on, the focus of their attention often is on how to resolve the source of that discontent. In other words, a lot of complaining, a lot of bickering, which competes with productive work. Okay? So a lot of problems with supervising from a predominantly negative standpoint. It also affects the supervisor. Those of you who are supervisors, you know what it's like when you go in, say, to monitor staff performance or to give some feedback or some instructions, and you can tell right away they don't want you there. You know, you look up and you see two teacher assistants over in the corner of the room there looking at you and talking. And, yeah. What happens is that because it's negative for the supervisor tends to avoid supervising those staff. We tend to be drawn to those folks who are more reinforcing to us. Unfortunately, they're often the ones who don't need as much supervision as the other folks. One of the examples is, you know, with performance monitoring, critical part of supervision. We need to monitor the performance of our staff. We need to monitor the degree to which consumers are attaining the outcomes that they should be attaining. The problem is, most of us don't like to be monitored, right? I've had situations, you know, and tried, you know, using some of the evidence-based procedures we're talking about, how to conduct monitoring in a way that's generally acceptable to staff, but still, every one time I'd be going from home to home on a residential center to monitor client engagement or active treatment, right? And I'd go into one home. Of course, some staff would immediately head out the back door taking clients to the park just to avoid being monitored. They'd also call the next home and say, Denny's out and about, okay? He'll be coming to your home next. Let them, you know, get prepared or escape the situation. You know, all of a sudden there's a band outing scheduled or whatever. But it's what happens when folks are, you know, do things that are negative to staff. They respond negatively to us. We tend to avoid doing those things, even in other parts of our job. So a lot of reasons that we focus on supervisory procedures that are not only effective for promoting diligent and proficient work, but to the degree possible, well received by staff. All right, what makes a supervisor successful? Now, this is soft data, but it's some data. Interpersonal skills. We've done a number of surveys where we would question mid-level supervisors, most of whom had functioned as direct support staff themselves. And what we're focusing on are the best and the worst ways to motivate staff, where we would describe motivation as helping staff work diligently and enjoy their work. Okay? And what can a supervisor do, or what does a supervisor do to really help staff? For folks to work diligently and enjoy their job. And what does a supervisor do that really impedes that? The most common number of responses came back, and we've replicated this with the same general results, over 1,000 supervisors now. The most common response is that what a supervisor can do to help motivate staff to enjoy their jobs and work diligently is to be nice. Supervisors who treat staff in a respectful and friendly way and give positive feedback. We were hoping positive feedback would be the main thing. It wasn't. The main thing was just being nice. Positive feedback was the second thing. Positive feedback meaning giving explicit approval of particular work performance. Being nice simply meaning when you pass a staff person in the hall, speak to them. If a staff person says something to you, respond, acknowledge. In contrast, what was reported most frequently as the biggest impediment in terms of supervisor behavior that impedes staff working diligently, enjoying their job, this is real rocket science, was not being nice. Supervisors who were rude or disrespectful for staff, simply passing someone in the hall, not speaking. Okay? Now there's good news and bad news about this, and keep in mind these are survey data. The good news is it's not rocket science. You know, part of what will help staff enjoy their work, okay, is simply being friendly or nice. That's good news. Bad news is, even though it's not rocket science, you know, in behavior analysis, we don't have a real good evidence-based technology for training typical adults how to be nice. Okay? You know, we don't have a good technology for promoting good interpersonal skills among adults. Okay? The implication of this is that when hiring supervisors, we want people who have a number of key skills, and we'll go through those, but we want them also to be interpersonally skillful. We're not talking about particularly bubbly or whatever, we're just talking about someone who has the interpersonal skills to be nice to other people. Because if they don't have those, it's likely to present some problems in the work area, and they are difficult to train to folks. At least they've been difficult for us. All right, other things that make a supervisor successful: content skills. What we mean by this is if you're supervising the performance of direct support staff, a supervisor needs to be able to do what he or she is supervising staff to do. Now, this isn't the case up and down the entire management chain in an agency. Obviously, if you're supervising professional staff from different fields, you won't know how to do everything they do. But generally, to promote proficient work among direct support staff, the supervisor needs to know how to do what they do. And we'll get into why in just a little bit. So we need the content skills. If we're supervising staff and how to teach people with disabilities, supervisor needs to know how to teach. If we're supervising staff in how to lift and transfer people who are non-ambulatory, supervisor needs to know how to do that. That's the content skills. Next, skills in applying evidence-based supervisory strategies. And those are what we're going to be going over and are going over. And in a sense, it's a logical extension of what we look at in terms of evidence-based procedures with clients who have disabilities. There's been a really nice movement, particularly in the autism area, in terms of a focus on evidence-based treatment procedures in the last decade and a half or so. Okay? We want to use procedures to help kids with autism that have a scientific basis to establish their effectiveness and efficacy. And in a way, those of you who've been in the field a real long time may remember back in the early days, there's kind of a cliche. Okay, there was something like, there are no bad students, just bad teachers. And the intent of that was not to put down teachers, but the intent of that was, we have good evidence-based behavioral procedures for teaching people, well established. When students aren't learning, that means we're not doing what we need to do to teach. Okay? Well, in the area of supervision, we need to take that a step further. Okay? If, for example, staff are not teaching well, supervisors are not supervising well. All right? If we're in a consultant role, which I do a lot of, and we're not seeing the change in staff behavior in the agency with which we're consulting, then we're not consulting very effectively. It's the premise of accountability. Supervisors are accountable for the performance of their staff. We have to accept that if we're going to be successful in the long run. If our supervisors are well equipped in evidence-based ways of supervising, they're much more likely to be effective. Okay? It's also important to note that supervisory skills and content skills are related, but they're not identical. In other words, we can know how to do what we want our staff to do. That doesn't necessarily mean we'll be an effective supervisor. And this is critical because most supervisors in the human services are promoted from the ranks of direct support where they did a nice job or they had a special relationship with the CEO. But we won't go there. Let me give an example of the difference between content skills and supervisory skills that we stumbled onto. It pertained to supervisors supervising the teaching performance of direct support staff working with individuals with intellectual disabilities. Okay? And what we found was we had trained our supervisors to competence in how to teach. Okay? Then put in a system for them to supervise the teaching performance of the staff that had also been trained to teach. Okay? And what we found, just so you know, what we found was the performance of the staff who were teaching was decreasing over time. In other words, their competence in teaching was getting worse after they'd been trained to teach effectively, even though the supervisors were observing and giving feedback. What we found was supervisors could teach, we trained them to teach. Supervisors were not doing a good job of giving critical feedback. They weren't able to zero in on what staff were doing well and give supportive feedback, or what they are not doing so well and give corrective feedback. So the point is they could teach, but they couldn't give feedback very well. When I say feedback, what we were training them to do, we'll come back to this one. This is a basic protocol that many of y'all are familiar with. We gleaned this from the literature and the research on different ways of giving feedback, going way back to the teaching family days out of Kansas. This is the protocol we used. All right. Primary supervisory skills that we try to train to our supervisors. Okay? I'm going to go through each of these relatively briefly. This is what we want our supervisors to learn how to do and to do on a consistent basis. First, specifying performance responsibilities. Now, those of you in OBM, you know this. We need to zero in on work behavior, okay? And it's straightforward for us. It is not straightforward for many supervisors of direct support staff. This is a difficult challenge for them. We run into issues all the time. Well, you know, I can't get my staff to do things because they don't have good work ethic. This younger generation, they really don't have a good work ethic. You know, we'll get this. Or it's the work attitude that I can't impact. And these are important concepts. We all understand that. But they have difficulty zeroing in on exactly what they want their staff to do or not do. And it's critical because everything starts with that. And in our approach, supervision, we start with whatever outcomes we want our consumers to attain. Learning functional skills, overcoming challenging behavior. Then we go with what do staff need to do to help consumers attain those outcomes. And that's what supervisors should be focusing on. They have to be able to zero in on what is it staff need to be doing. So we come up with these criteria, y'all know these. Behavior that can be directly observed. We know that it's defined sufficiently as behavior when several of us can go in and agree when it's occurring or not occurring. Okay? We want to get it to the point so supervisors can walk in a staff workplace and immediately determine if what staff are doing is what they should be doing or not. Okay? Just like if I do my job now, I should be, constantly looking around at y'all to see if y'all appear to be attending to me. And if you're not, then I should do something different, right? So when I tell my next joke, that's because, some of y'all are starting to nod off or whatever, regardless of if you like the joke or not. Second, supervisory skill is how to train staff, okay? And we have a very powerful technology for training work skills to staff, which many of y'all are familiar with. It's now more frequently called behavioral skills training. It's performance and competency based. These are the basic steps, and y'all know this. We train our supervisors, when we do it right, how to train staff, both in a formal session, but most importantly on the job. And the essence of it, as y'all are well aware, many of y'all are well aware, explain to staff what you want them to do and the rationale for doing that. Give them a written summary of what to do. Demonstrate it. Have them practice it while you watch. Give them feedback and keep repeating those steps until they do it well. Okay? And again, that can be done formally. It can be done informally on the job. This is one of the supervisory skills that highlights the need of supervisors to have content skills. Because you can't train somebody to do something if you don't know how to do it yourself. And often, well not often, but sometimes supervisors are in the position of being expected to train staff to do something that they're not confident in doing themselves. For example, let's say, through the nature of how the agency is set up, the supervisor is supposed to train certain staff in how to carry out an individual's behavior support plan if the supervisor hasn't been trained very well by whoever developed the plan. What we tell our supervisors, this is very professional, if you're in a situation where you're expected to train staff to do something that you don't know how to do, find a way to weasel out of it. Because if you're trying to train staff in something you don't know how to do, staff are going to pick up on it. We know when someone's putting us on. Staff lose credibility for the supervisor. It's not going to be effective anyhow. We know that from the get-go. So find a way to get out of it.
Is that 3A? Would that be weasel would be 3A?
Some things we don't write down. We only talk about it. That's not in our written curriculum. Monitoring staff work, we've talked about this. We have to train our supervisors in how to monitor. And everybody feels like they already know how to monitor. But we focus on both formal monitoring, when we go in with the explicit purpose of monitoring performance with a set form, okay? And such that we can do it in a consistent and systematic manner. And informally, which means, making periodic spot checks whenever you're in the work site to see what folks are doing. And when we train supervisors, we always focus on why do you monitor informally? Well, the logical answer is so you know what your staff are doing. That's accurate. Equally importantly, you monitor informally because it gives you occasions to support proficient staff performance. You look and see what folks are doing. Those who are doing it well, you never know they're doing it well. That's why we focus on this. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, monitoring staff performance is one of those things that a lot of staff don't like, which is just like you and me. I think it's just natural human tendency, What would you think if your supervisor walks into your workstation and says, "Don't mind me, I'm just here to monitor you"? What kind of reaction does that evoke? I'm betting it's not one of utter belief. Unless you have a supervisor who you enjoy working for, because you know that supervisor is going to recognize what you're doing well and let you know that you're doing it well. I've worked for one supervisor like that in my career, and we like seeing her come in to the work site and giving us good feedback. That was Judy Fable, by the way, who some of you don't know in Florida. Because she'd always find something. She was very confident in doing what you're supposed to do, and she'd find something you were doing well. But most of the time when someone says they're coming in to observe, it's not the best part of our day. And I want to focus on monitoring because it is a critical part. It's something that doesn't go on very well in a lot of human service agencies. And when it does go on, often it has more negative effects than positive effects. So I'm going to go through an investigation that we did a little while ago. Bear with me, but I'd be remiss. I'm talking about evidence-based supervisory procedures if I didn't present some data. All right. For those agencies who do have some behavioral management procedures in place, the common approach is, let's say we train our supervisors how to observe a certain area of staff performance. Okay? Then we instruct our supervisors to monitor that area of staff performance on a regular basis, say weekly or 2 times a month. They fill out a form indicating that they monitored staff performance and how well staff did. Those forms are then turned into central office, usually the supervisor of the supervisors. Okay? So we have that system in place, right? Where supervisors are observing, giving feedback to staff. We're ensuring that they do that based on the forms they turn in. That is actually kind of means providing indirect feedback to supervisors. Indirect in that we're responding, we as upper management, we're responding to the forms that supervisors turned in that they have observed and given feedback to staff. Okay? That's a fairly common situation for those agencies attempting to use a behavioral approach to supervision. We wanted to look at that with a management approach that In contrast to having supervisors observe staff, complete their observation forms or checklists, and turn those in to us, that in addition to supervisors observing staff and completing forms, we would observe supervisors observing staff and giving feedback, okay? I wanted to compare those two approaches. The latter, of course, much more labor intensive than the former. It is time consuming. It also gets kind of ducky. That's professional diagnosis. But think about it. What we're focusing on in this illustration is direct support staff teaching clients. And supervisors are observing the direct support staff teach the clients and then give feedback. Now we come in, we observe the supervisor observing the staff teaching the client, and we give feedback to the supervisor. Can you imagine when we do that, like say with teaching toothbrushing in the bathroom? We got the client, the staff, the supervisor, and us. It can get a little awkward, so we have to work through that stuff. All right. All staff and supervisors are trained to teach in 4 basic teaching skills, using a task analysis, less to more system prompt sequence, error correction, and reinforcement. They were taught competence on that. Then in baseline, that's when they were taught, and they were taught to give feedback using that protocol that I summarized earlier, probably too quickly for you to get all the steps, but feedback protocol, starting on a positive or empathetic note, letting staff know specifically what they did well, letting them know what they didn't do so well if applicable, and how to correct that. Giving staff the opportunity to ask questions or clarify what was said, then informing staff what's going to happen next in regard to this performance, which that step, by the way, just so you know why that one is in there, some of you all are familiar with this, that one's in there because in human services, we go through a lot of fads and we go through a lot of different types of focus. Experienced staff, like some of you and me, we learn that, just lie low. Over time, this too shall pass. So just stay below the radar. Whatever management's hyped up about this month, stay cool, it'll pass. Okay? By letting them know what's going to happen next, like, yeah, I'll come back next week and we'll observe again and talk about this. They know it's not going to go away. Okay? The intent is, hopefully, that we're giving good feedback, and staff will want the supervisors coming back in to see how well they're doing what they're doing and let them know they're doing well. That's what we want. We don't always get that. However, sometimes some staff will improve their performance or work harder just to get us to quit coming back so often. Okay? So when we have to, we use the negative reinforcement paradigm as well. Anyway, so everybody was trained, the supervisors were trained how to teach, how to give feedback. And then they're expected to go out on a regular basis, observe staff teaching clients, and give feedback. And the no feedback, that was the typical situation. Supervisors observe, give feedback, complete their forms, turn in the central office. Then we would look at the recordings of the supervisor versus doing that plus going out and watching the supervisors observe staff teaching and giving feedback. Now you have to bear with me. This is going to be difficult to see. Training, that's when the supervisors, this is 6 supervisors across the panels, were trained in 2 sets of skills. One, the open circles, if you can see them, is how to give feedback using the protocol. And 2 was to observe proficiency of staff teaching. And this is where we would go in and observe with the supervisors, see how accurately their evaluation of staff teaching proficiency coincided with the standard, which was ours. Okay? Then, half the supervisors got the direct feedback. Direct feedback, 1st, 3rd, and 5th panels. That means after they were trained competence in observing teaching of staff and giving feedback, they started doing that, and we were going out observing the supervisors and giving feedback regarding their evaluation of staff teaching, and they're giving feedback. Versus, direct feedback, that's where they're simply assigned to go out and do it and turn in the forms. In other words, supervisors were not observed. What you see is Those who are giving direct feedback continued at a pretty high level. No direct feedback, they dropped down until they got direct feedback. So in each case, no direct feedback, drop down below the baseline, and then improve once they got direct feedback. And I'm going to this quickly, bear with me. Basically, what this suggested was when supervisor instructed to go out, observe, and give feedback, when we said put that system in place, that's not sufficient. We also need to observe the performance of the supervisor. The moral of this story: whose work behavior needs to be monitored in the service agency? Everybody's. Okay? We all respond to contingencies. Sometimes we respond to instructions. But if we want a quality agency, we need data on how well everybody's doing their job. Some people more than others. Okay? Really good agencies that have a behavioral system have this in place. Unfortunately, there's just not that many of them around the country. Speaking of the moral of the story, did I tell you about Aunt Gertrude? Probably not. Yeah, we don't want to take ourselves too serious. This is important stuff, but you know, if you work in human services, you got to flow with the punches every now and then. But anyway, so a group of second graders in a classroom, and the teacher says, I want you each to go home and talk to your mom or daddy and have them tell you a story with an important moral. And come back and tell us tomorrow. So next day, came back, and second graders got a chance to go over the moral of the story that mom or dad had talked to them. The usual ones came up, you know, penny saved, penny earned, do good unto others, and everybody had a neat little story except Bradley. Bradley didn't say a word. So the teacher says, Bradley, did your mom or daddy not tell you a story with moral? She said, yes, ma'am, my daddy did. She said, well, would you like to share it? He said, okay. This is about Aunt Gertrude. Now, Aunt Gertrude was in the reserve, and she got called into action. And she really didn't think that she was going to have to get in any serious action, and she was in an airplane, but the airplane took on enemy fire. And so they had to parachute out of the airplane. Now, Aunt Gertrude wasn't expecting to get any action. She had a bottle of whiskey with her. And she was afraid when she parachuted out that she'd break that bottle of whiskey. So when she was parachuting out, she chugged the whole bottle. Okay? So when she landed, not only did Dad say she was wasted, but unfortunately she landed in the middle of an enemy patrol. There were 6 enemy soldiers. Well, Aunt Gertrude immediately engaged 3 of them in hand-to-hand combat and subdued them. The other 3 hightailed it, started to run. Aunt Gertrude ran them down, subdued them in hand-to-hand combat again, tied them up with the cords from her parachute. About this time, teacher, she's looking horrified. Well, what did your daddy say the moral of the story was? Bradley looks at the teacher and says, ma'am, my daddy said the moral of that story is don't mess with Aunt Gertrude when she's been drinking. So everything has a moral. Moving right along. All right. We talked about that. Another critical supervisory skill, supportive supervision. First line of implementation here is using the feedback protocol, giving supportive feedback, letting folks know specifically what they did well. And that second step in the feedback protocol, specifying what staff really did well, is critical. Very useful supervisory skill. Supplementing that with formal and informal recognition procedures, calling a staff member into your office for the sole purpose of letting her know she's done a really good job in carrying out some behavior support plans. Supplementing routine provision of feedback with both formal and informal recognition procedures. Corrective supervision, that's built into feedback as well, as you know. That's the first line of implementation. When that doesn't work, disciplinary action. If we put all the things in place, good training, frequent observation, a lot of supportive feedback, and someone's not doing the job, we give corrective feedback, we do it again. If it doesn't improve, then you got to take care of business, go the disciplinary action route. And when we train our supervisors, they obviously have to be supported from above, but when you have to get to the point of disciplinary action, you take as quick and severe action as you can to solve the problem. Now, if you're doing this a lot, then there's a problem with the overall supervision. It should be the exception rather than the rule. When we have to use it, we use it effectively. Appropriate use means supervisors have to be trained in agency policies regarding disciplinary action, that it's wise to let your superiors know before you take it, because often if you don't let them know, they're going to hear about it from the disgruntled employee. You're more likely to get their support if they know about it beforehand, and similar procedures, short and long-term effects. Very quickly, the long-term effect, well, the short-term effect is that, and you know, if you've done this, if you fired somebody, you're going to be the bad guy or gal in the agency. Staff usually rally around the person whose job was terminated or severe action was taken, no matter how poorly that person may have been performing. But if that action is taken in conjunction with the other supervisory procedures we've talked about, and primarily supportive procedures, then over time, staff respect the supervisor who will step up and take care of business. The long-term effects is it helps to make a better organization. But the short-term effects are very unpleasant for the supervisor typically. Default procedures, job termination, that means, we do everything that we should as a supervisor and it doesn't work. Take care of business, move the person out from the agency. Again though, we're having to do this a lot over a long time period. We're amiss in our overall supervisory approach, and we need to make some major changes. Things I've talked about, we do have, and Clay mentioned this, a new curriculum for training supervisors. I have a flyer on it up here if anybody's interested. We don't put this out with our company, but AEIDD does now. Summary. Supervisors got to know how to do what they're supervising their staff to do. They need to be skilled in evidence-based supervisory procedures regarding specifying performance responsibilities as work behavior, using behavioral skills training, giving good feedback. If we can get it to be pleasant, that's even better. When all that doesn't work, take care of business, move them out. Okay? And the last thing I'm going to do is go over something that we also tell supervisors. We did not originate this little scenario. Some of you have heard this. As I go through this, bear with me if you have heard it. If you have heard it, please don't tell your neighbor the punchline because that would hurt my feelings. But anyhow, make a point with supervisors in terms of being a successful supervisor in the human services. There are certain skills one has to use them consistently. Our technology is not perfect. So there's an old man and a little boy. And they're farmers. And they're taking their farm goods to market. Okay? And they've got an old donkey, a jackass, with baskets on both sides and the farm goods and the baskets, right? And they're walking down this path. And as they're walking down, they see a guy, kind of dressed up tight, kind of like me, walking down. This guy walks up to him and says, "Excuse me, but I'm an efficiency analysis expert from the state office, and I want to know why you've got this perfectly healthy farm animal and both you guys are walking. That's not a good use of resources." So the old man looks at the little boy looks at the old man. The little boy gets on the donkey. They get down the path, and soon this lady comes down the path, kind of tired dressed. She walks up and says, "Excuse me, I am from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and I want to know why this very healthy young boy gets to ride this donkey and this old man has to walk. That looks like age discrimination to me." So the little boy gets off the donkey, the old man gets on. Sure enough, somebody else comes walking down and says, "Excuse me, I'm from Protection and Advocacy, and I want to know why this grown adult gets to ride the donkey and this young little boy has to walk." If that's not child abuse, it's certainly neglect. So, what do? The old man and the little boy get on the donkey. Okay? One more person coming down the path. You can imagine who this person is. Excuse me, I'm an animal rights activist. I want to know why you healthy guys are riding this animal who also has all these farm goods. That's clearly abusive to this poor animal. About this time, donkey's on a bridge over a small creek, and it's had all it can handle. Slips, hits the bridge, falls into the creek below, and drowns. The moral of this story is when you're a supervisor in human services, and you try to please all the people all the time, you might as well kiss your ass goodbye. Thank you. Appreciate it.